According to Aquinas, there are these four kinds of law. And what we're going to do now is examine them in greater detail. So we've had Aquinas initially gives us a kind of brief overview, and I gave you a brief overview of them. And then Aquinas goes into greater detail concerning each of the four kinds of law. And I'm going to follow the same kind of strategy. And so the first one we're going to look at is the eternal law, which is, as we discussed earlier, something like God's providential plan for all things. God, according to Aquinas, is the creator of the world, of the universe, of everything. And the eternal law, it's something like the plan that God had in mind when God made everything and created everything and set everything off on the way that it's going. And he compares God and the eternal law to a craftsman and the plan that the craftsman has in mind. And we talked about this last time. Now, what I want to do, or in a previous video, we talked about this. What I want to do now, though, is explain this, go into a little bit more detail on this point. In what sense is God like a craftsman? How is this the eternal law? What exactly does this all mean? And so on. And so I'm going to give you an example. We're going to have God, right, thinking about things. So this is prior to kind of making anything, right? And this is going to be a very simplified and, whatever. But just to illustrate the point. So there's God thinking about things, hanging out with a bunch of angels, it looks like, and just thinking about things. Well, one of the things, what we're going to do is not look at the entire eternal law, but we're going to look at a little part of that eternal law. We're not going to look at the entirety of God's providential plan. We're going to look at just a little sliver of that for the sake of illustration. And the little sliver that we're going to consider is or concerns ducks. God's eternal law for ducks, or as it applies to ducks, the providential plan for ducks, right? So here would be how it works. God is thinking, right? Hasn't made anything yet, before creation, if you will. And one of the things that he's going to think about on Aquinas' view, he's going to come up with this idea of an animal that's got feathers and wings and it flies. But it's not like, some of these other things like that, some of these other birds that live in trees. Or no, this thing's going to live in the water, and it's not going to chirp a nice bird song. It's going to quack at you. It's really annoying quack sound. It's going to lay eggs. It's going to eat bugs, or I don't know what ducks do, right? It's going to do all these things. He comes up with the idea of a duck, right? He comes up, in other words, with duck nature, right? That sounds a little bit odd. I mean, maybe all this sounds a little bit odd, but we often talk about human nature. Well, look, there's also a thing, duck nature. Ducks have a nature. They're a particular kind of organism that lives a particular kind of life. And if you saw a duck, I don't know, wearing clothes, giving live birth, I don't know, and, eating, I don't know, drinking a juice box or something, you say, that's a weird duck, right? That duck's not acting like a duck at all. That duck, right, if you wanted to be kind of sophisticated about it, you could say that duck's kind of acting contrary to duck nature, right? There's something about the nature of ducks that involves them acting or behaving in very particular ways, living a very particular kind of life. Ducks don't wear clothes. They just have their feathers, and they they don't drink juice boxes. I don't know what they do. They drink mud. I have no idea what ducks do. Right? But that's duck nature. And so God thinks this up. And this, of course, applies not just to ducks, but anything you like to think of. We could have done the same thing with ants and oak trees and everything else, okay? God thinks this idea up. And then he makes things. that accord with that idea, right? He kind of has the idea of a duck and then bam, makes a bunch of ducks or something like that, right? This is an oversimplified story, right? An actual fact or whatever. I don't think a Thomist would be committed to saying he just zaps everything into existence. No, you could have evolution and so on, whatever, but don't worry about that. Right? So, boom, now we have actual ducks that go around acting according to this plan that God had for them. Right? They go around quacking. They go around laying eggs, eating bugs and plants, and flying and doing all the other things that ducks do. So he makes these specific ducks and he kind of gives a law to them through their nature, right? He like builds it into them. You are supposed to do this. You are supposed to quack, right? So the law would be something like the eternal law as it applies to ducks. It tells ducks to quack, to lay eggs and drink mud or eat bugs and plants or whatever it might be, and fly around and be annoying and whatever, right? That's the eternal law as it applies to ducks, right? And so ducks listen to it, not consciously. It's not like they think about, oh, God made us like this, and so I better go quack at that human being and ruin their run or whatever. Rather, these commands kind of come to the ducks through their nature, through their instinct. They just follow these commands kind of instinctively or instinctually. I don't know which way you say that. Something like that, right? And those are the commands that's the eternal law as it applies to ducks. And I hope you can see how it's actually it's part of this plan, this providential plan, and it actually does kind of consist in certain commands. Moreover, it's for the good of the duck in a sense, right? What the idea would be something like this. When a duck follows nature, follows its duck nature, follows this divine plan that God has come up with, that's a good duck, right? A duck that listens to these commands, so to speak, that follows these commands and does all of these duck things, does the duck things and does them with gusto, does them well, right? That's a good duck. That's what a duck should be like. There's a duck for you, right? That's the idea. That's a good, flourishing duck. And so the eternal law, that's God's providential plan for all things. The eternal law as it applies to ducks, it commands ducks to do the duck things, to be and act like ducks. And you could say the same thing for any other animal or organism you like out there, right? There's the eternal law as it applies to oak trees. Oak trees are part of this whole shebang, right? God made the whole thing, this whole system, this whole universe. Oak trees are a part of it. They're a small little part of it or whatever. Well, I mean, some oak trees are pretty big, I guess. But he gives commands to the oak trees. Behave like this. Shoot down your roots. Grow to be huge and drop acorns and whatever else, right? The oak tree nature, right? That's how, and again, it's even clear in the case of an oak tree. It's not like an oak tree can like, oh, what's my nature? Oh, I should do that then, right? It's not like they think about it at all. They just by nature do these things, right? And it applies not just to animals like ducks or dogs or frogs or bugs or I know a lot of animals. And it applies not just to plants. It's also going to apply to inanimate things. So take the kind of fundamental particles of physics. I can't remember the exact number of them. There's some number of them, like a dozen, a couple dozen. I can't remember how many there are, right? There's these kind of fundamental particles that physicists think kind of make up everything, right? So they're even smaller than atoms because your atoms are made of electrons and protons, but then protons themselves are made out of these even more fundamental particles like leptons and quarks and bosons, and I don't know how it goes. But one of these is quarks, right? So that's one of these fundamental particles that physicists think everything in the world is made up out of, or everything in the world is made up out of these fundamental particles. Quarks is one of these fundamental particles. Well, in Aquinas' view, quarks are part of the whole shebang. They're part of the whole universe, and they have a particular nature, right? Quarks behave in highly specific and particular ways. They are governed by certain laws, and those laws dictate what they do, how they interact with each other, with other particles, and so on. And so dictate ultimately um, the way that matter, that physical things behave, right? And so the eternal law, as it applies to quarks or atoms or electrons or whatever, right? It tells those things to do, right? It tells quarks to do the quark things. And if you knew more about quantum mechanics, you would know what that is. I don't know what that is. Take like electrons. I think electrons are a fundamental particle. I'm not entirely sure. All right, but they zoom around atoms at a certain speed, and then they get attracted to other things, and they got charge and whatever, and they do all this kind of stuff, right? All that's part of the nature of an electron. And the eternal law, as it applies to electrons, tells electrons to, be negatively charged, have a negative charge. And so then to do the things that entails, right? Things that have negative charge attract certain other things. They get attracted to certain, and so on, right? Do those things. That's what the eternal law says do electrons, right? That's part of God's plan for everything, matter and the way it behaves. And it's because of this idea, right? Aquinas wasn't the only one to put forward an idea like this, but it's because of this idea that the eternal law, that there's a law that applies to things like matter, right? That's why historically we come to talk about laws of physics. If you think about it for 2 seconds, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if you have arguably, right? Depends on, well, put it this way. We find it very natural today to just talk about the laws of physics. But whenever you have a law, that seems to imply some sort of lawgiver. And originally, this lawgiver was understood to be someone like God. And so today, when we still talk about a lawgiver, I think, or we still talk about natural laws, many people don't see God as the lawgiver or whatever. But the idea would be, what we can see now is that's a kind of holdover. That language talking about scientific laws is a holdover from this earlier time, this earlier view of the universe, according to which there was, or people much more widely than today thought there was, a divine lawgiver who orchestrated the world to follow these laws and so on, these physical laws, these laws of science and so on. And so you can see that kind of cropping up here in Aquinas' eternal law, right? Now, what I've kind of been hinting at, but let's now make it a little bit more explicit. Aquinas thinks the eternal law can be known by us, at least in part. We can know parts of the eternal law. For example, we can come to know the eternal law as it applies to ducks. Go study ducks. Go see how they act. Go see what they do, how they live their lives, when they mate, when they fly south, what they eat, and right? Go be a scientist who studies ducks. And what you're discovering there, Aquinas would say, in the kind of final analysis of things, is part of God's plan for all of creation. Ducks are a part of that plan. And when you really study them, you really figure out how they work and how they behave and why and so on, right? You're figuring out that little corner of God's plan, of God's providential plan for all things. Yeah. Likewise with quarks. Yeah, go study how they behave. Become a particle physicist. I don't know what that's called. Go, whatever, a quantum physicist. Quantum mechanics physics. I don't know what they'd be called. Go do that. And what you'd be discovering, right? And it's not as though all your thoughts would be about God or something like that. But in the final analysis, what you've actually uncovered is this kind of little part of God's eternal law, of the eternal law, of God's providential plan for all things. And so human beings can, in fact, come to know the eternal law in part, according to Aquinas. That's what you're doing through science. And so someone like Aquinas and the people that follow in Aquinas's or are influenced by Aquinas, that follow kind of in his footsteps, they tend not to see any kind of conflict between science and religion. I know this is like a very common thing to hear, science and religion, and you can't have them both, or whatever like that. Thomists think that the idea that there's a conflict there is silly. God created the world, and he created it with a rational structure, with a kind of rational plan that our minds, our intellects are able to discern, are able to figure out. And by doing science, by exercising our rational capacities on the data given through empirical observation and so on, we can figure it out. We can figure out how certain parts of this universe work. That's what science is, right? And so by engaging in science, we're figuring out in part the eternal law, God's providential plan for all things, something like that. And indeed, Aquinas suggests that any truth that you can come to know is in fact a part of the eternal law. Because God knows the whole plan beforehand. He knows everything that's going to happen in Aquinas' view. And so anything that happens, however insignificant and slight, would seem to be part of this eternal law. So simply knowing, how many little, this is a gingham shirt, I think that's what they call it. I can't remember. Knowing how many little squares are on the shirt. Right? It's totally insignificant, doesn't matter at all, but that's part of the plan. It's one of the most insignificant parts of the plan, probably, of God's providential plan, but it's still part of it. And if you come to know that, if I sat down and counted all the little squares on my shirt or whatever, well, I'd be knowing a part of the eternal law. Very unimportant part of the eternal law, but a part nonetheless. Okay. Well, can we know the whole thing? No. Aquinas is clear about this. We can only know the eternal law in part. To know the whole thing is beyond a human being's ability. That would be Aquinas, and this doesn't matter so much, but that would essentially be to know God in God's entirety. We can't know the entirety of God's providential plan for all things. To know that, you would have to be God. We can only know it in part. Knowing the whole thing outstrips our abilities and our intellectual abilities, our rational capacities. And so we can only know it in part, but we can, in fact, know it in part, according to Aquinas, simply by, for example, engaging in science or by thinking about the natural law, because we can also know the natural law, according to Aquinas, and we are going to turn to the natural law next.